Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Timothy Judson. I'm with a U.S. NGO called the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, and this is a press conference being held by the Don't Nuke the Climate Coalition. The Don't Nuke the Climate Coalition has been participating in the COP since COP6, and we share a vision of a nuclear-free, carbon-free world run with 100% renewable energy with a just and equitable energy transition. We have a statement that has been signed by 629 NGOs from around the world supporting this agenda, and we are here in opposition to the proposal or the pledge by now 31 countries for a global nuclear energy expansion to triple nuclear energy worldwide by 2050. This is supposed to be the finance COP, and to bring enough climate finance for this just transition and to preserve a livable climate. And what we have heard this week from the nuclear industry here at the COP is actually really illuminating. Earlier this week, there was a number circulated by nuclear industry representatives that the tripling of nuclear energy by 2050 would cost $5 trillion. Now, this is based on a lowball, very, very unrealistically low estimate to build nuclear reactors. But the reality is that the amount of climate finance that's being proposed here at the COP, which is needed to make a huge difference, is $1.3 trillion per year. And so what the nuclear industry is proposing is essentially to swallow whole multiple years of climate finance in order to build this nuclear power agenda. And what we know also is that the way the nuclear projects operate around the world is they provide a low estimate, an unrealistically low estimate, in order to get approval. But then quickly the costs start to rise once construction starts. And so what would happen if this agenda is pursued is that the cost in climate finance to bail out nuclear projects around the world would quickly exceed $5 trillion. And would really stand in the way of the just energy transition that is needed in order to solve the climate crisis. There's also been a lot of misinformation being told about nuclear power at the COP this week. And so we are here with representatives from a number of organizations in the coalition to shed some light on the realities of what this global nuclear expansion would mean. So first I'm going to introduce Vladimir Sliviak of the Russian NGO Ecodefense, who was also the 2021 Right Livelihood Award winner. And I'll pass it to you, Vladimir.
Thank you very much, Tim. First thing I wanted to stress is that, we oppose to using nuclear power as a climate crisis solution for a very simple reason. It takes too long to build nuclear reactors, and we need climate action today, not in 10 or 20 years from now, when nuclear reactors may be completed. We need cheaper solutions than nuclear. And nuclear, well, if you look into what business says, like, for example, one of the leading investment bank, Lazard, who's every year showing the numbers, how much the energy cost, and we can see that new nuclear power plant is the most expensive source of energy among all today. And on the contrary, renewable sources of energy are not going to be expensive after time, like nuclear power. It's going to be cheaper and cheaper, and this is what we've seen over the last few decades, that renewable energy became a very cheap one compared to what it was a couple of decades ago. And of course, nuclear power remains dangerous because it produces nuclear waste that will be dangerous for next many thousands of years. It's actually very useful to look at how many new nuclear reactors are under construction around the world right now. It's something like 50 plus of units under construction. But half of this is under construction in different countries by a Russian nuclear power corporation, Rosatom, that belongs to Russian state and funded 100% by Russian state. And that is for a very simple reason, not because nuclear power is cheap and it's good climate solution or anything like that. It's because Russian President Vladimir Putin is so keen to extend his geopolitical influence around the world. And building nuclear power plants around the world is actually a very good instrument for it. It's a good instrument to control, especially developing countries, because once you agree once you sign a contract with Rosatom or any other nuclear corporation around the world, you will be dependent for the next 100, actually more than 100 of years, on the specific technology, on the engineers from this country, on the supply of nuclear fuel. And the nuclear fuel is not something like a fossil fuel where you can actually go on the market and select who will supply it to you. With nuclear fuel, you are stuck with a specific company that builds reactor in your country, and it's only this company who can then supply fuel for you. So, I mean, what Russia is doing is basically, well, or Vladimir Putin, Russian president, doing, he's paying from a Russian state budget for all those new reactors that are in construction around the world. And it's because he wants to be influential around the world, not because it's good for climate or it's cheap. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that, well, there is a war that Russia started in Ukraine in the beginning of 2022. And we've seen that Russian nuclear corporation Rosatom been deeply involved in this war. They helped the Russian army to occupy the Chernobyl contaminated with radiation zone in the beginning of war. Then they occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, and the Russian army is still there. And it's a very good example that's showing how so-called civil nuclear power object or plant can be weaponized if there would be a war happening close to this nuclear power plant. And I want to end my statement with saying that we demand peace for Ukraine, and war must be stopped immediately, and the Russian army should go back home. Thank you very much.
So next I would like to introduce Makoma Lakalakala of EarthLife Africa, who is also the 2018 Goldman Environmental Prize winner.
Good afternoon. The future will look up to us and ask us what happened. The cost of nuclear power is too huge to be ignored. It's carbon intensive, not a solution to climate change. Nuclear is not a transitional fuel and cannot be part of what we see as a solution towards the crisis that we have of increasing greenhouse gas emissions that are continuing and cannot be stopped. The cost of massive expenditure required by nuclear power is not only less public money spending on key services like health and education, and so it's too costly. The other thing is that when we talk about transition or transitioning towards a low carbon investment, restorative justice, it's at the center. So we would not want, or we don't have to see what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo continuously happening again, what is happening in Niger, what is happening in Tanzania with uranium mining and people paying with their lives, paying with their land. And that is a cost of nuclear energy, particularly in Africa. And this is what we are saying, that it's costly and we can no longer continue having people paying with their land and their lives. From uranium mining to accidents that have taken people's lives away, that's a cost that we should always keep it in our mind, that we cannot allow this to happen. African countries can no longer further be indebted and turned radioactive. We see a massive marketing of nuclear power in Africa by trying to hoodwink or give false hope that nuclear is a solution to climate change, and we know it's not. It's carbon intensive. From South Africa to Egypt, nuclear, it's not necessary. We have abundant resources of renewable energy, and this is where a greater investment has got to happen. And this is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been saying all over the time when the UNFCCC is meeting through their assessment reports that we need to move towards a low carbon economic development. Evidence of people's lands and uranium mined has told us that this is too costly, but all the other issues that are being raised, the concerns that have been raised by people about whether nuclear is a solution to climate change, it cannot. It's a violation. Actually, we don't want to see what has been happening in the past, and that we cannot allow it to happen. It's too costly for our climate, and so it should not continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Makoma. Next, I would like to introduce two representatives of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winning organization, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. First, Karina Lester, who's an ambassador to ICANN.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Karina Lester. I'm a Yankunytjatjara woman from the Western Desert region in South Australia, back in Australia. But I'm also a second-generation survivor of British nuclear tests that took place in our traditional lands. And there were two locations, Emu Field and Maralinga, Jarrudja. And so those traditional lands have now been contaminated after 70-odd years of the acts and the testing program that took place in the 50s and 60s as well. So First Nations peoples in Australia are often and continue to be pressured by the industry from that dark history of the testing that took place in the 50s and 60s through to mining on our traditional lands of uranium, but also the constant pressure of being the waste dump of this industry as well. This has been a huge, huge impact on First Nations peoples, and constantly we are needing to fight and speak up strong against this industry on how we as First Nations peoples are constantly in the struggles and needing to fight against this. Recently, our Australian government coalition, the opposition, made an announcement around nuclear power plants, and these plants have been identified, of course, on Australian soil, but on our traditional lands, and we are very concerned around this. Many First Nations peoples across the nation are concerned about what this looks like and the impact that it will have on Indigenous peoples. Now, we often face Aboriginal people, First Nations peoples in Australia, a disproportionate burden on our communities, constantly pressured by our government, and this recent announcement is a huge concern and pressure on First Nations peoples. We've been very active in voicing our concerns, and that Australia needs to hear carefully from First Nations peoples across our nation, and that we send a strong message that we are not interested in nuclear power plants on our traditional lands. We've here today, we've heard about the expense to set these up, and so there'll be a huge burden for Australia and for many of the next generation. And again, Australians will be facing the struggles of this, and First Nations peoples will be faced with this struggle on this as well. It is our cultural responsibility to look after our traditional lands. It is our cultural responsibility to protect our people and the next generation as well. Our intangible cultural heritage is who we are. and these have been challenged over the many decades from that testing program through to now, the very high risk of nuclear power plants on our traditional lands. So from First Nations peoples of Australia, we say no to anything nuclear and nuclear power connected as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karina. And next I'll introduce Dave Sweeney of the Australian Conservation Foundation and a co-founder of ICANN.
Thank you. It's very good to have the opportunity to speak here today, and to speak after Karina is a privilege. We have travelled from Australia to Baku, to Azerbaijan, with a simple message that, be it from the city or the bush, Australians are concerned about and opposed to proposals for nuclear power in our country. We have had decades of this industry through mining of uranium, through bomb testing, through radioactive waste disposal plants, and all of these have been characterised by top-down imposition and successful and sustained bottom-up resistance. Australia is now facing an energy challenge and an energy choice. Our challenge is how to replace coal. Our choice is, we firmly believe, renewable. It's either renewable or it's a nuclear fuel delay, not response, but delay, that would see longer coal and far more gas. And this choice is becoming increasingly contested ahead of Australia's next federal election, which must happen before June 2025. The Conservative opposition support nuclear. The federal government, the independents, the Greens and the crossbench do not. And I'm also here to convey that a great many Australians do not support nuclear. And it's people in the street, but it's also the providers, transmitters, retailers of energy. All of Australia's energy sector has said no to nuclear and has instead promoted renewables. Australia is already 40% renewable nation. In some states and provinces, that figure is 75%. In some states and provinces, it is 100%. We are blessed with diverse and plentiful renewable resources, and unlike nuclear, these are quicker, cheaper, cleaner, safer to deploy. So today, Tim referenced the Don't Nuke the Climate International statement, with over 600 international groups committing to work actively for a nuclear-free future. There is a new Australian civil society statement presented and drafted for this forum, the COP in Baku. It has more than 30 groups' signatories on this, and they represent multiple millions of Australians across environmental, First Nation, public health, faith, trade union organisations and communities. And the Australian experience in our current struggle, it reflects the concerns of many around the world. We've heard snapshots around the world here today. Different places, similar stories, similar struggles, because we live on one shared planet that is facing urgent, pressing and escalating climate pressures, and urgent action is needed. And I'll finish with the last part of this statement, which reads, Australia and the world cannot afford nuclear delay and distraction. We stand resolute in our support for real climate action through a clean energy transition and in our opposition to false nuclear promises. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. And last, I'll introduce Dr. Bimal Kadka of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War.
Thank you. I have the pleasure of addressing this esteemed gathering as a representative of International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, IPPNW. As a medical professionals, our foremost goal is prevention. Stopping the escalation of the climate crisis is vital for our survival, and this is undisputable. We believe that the nuclear energy is not a viable solution and may actually hinder necessary progress. Despite some advocating for increased nuclear power at this COP summit in the name of climate action, as a physician, I must highlight the health hazards linked to the nuclear power. These risks are not evenly distributed and thus infringe upon the right to good health for all. Moreover, as a representative of an organization dedicated to preventing a nuclear war, it is crucial to emphasize that the nuclear power fuels the development of nuclear weapons, and long-term prevention must include phasing out nuclear power. When we think of the health risks associated with the nuclear power, the first thing that understandably come to the mind are the nuclear accidents. Fukushima serves as a notable example, where the incidence of thyroid cancer, a critical indicator of health impact of radiation incident, has been significant rise since 2011. This mirrors the situation following the Chernobyl nuclear accident, which has been documented to cause 20,000 thyroid cancer cases. It's most important to note that the nuclear power poses a significant health risk, even during the normal operations across the production chain. As physicians, we know that the frequently cited claim by the nuclear power advocates that the ionizing radiation is harmless below a certain level is scientifically inaccurate. It's well established that there is a direct relationship between the radiation dose and the likelihood of developing health issues with no safe threshold. Epidemiological studies have confirmed these effects throughout the entire process of generating electricity from nuclear power. This brings me to the second point. Nuclear power is rooted in global injustice. The entire nuclear chain, from uranium mining to the unresolved issue of nuclear waste, poses a significant health risk impacting vulnerable communities. The sourcing of uranium still follows a colonial patterns, and expanding nuclear power would worsen the imbalance between those who profit and those who are affected. We must champion the global justice and the human rights to health by investing in renewable energy and not perpetuating the false solution of nuclear power. My final point brings us back to the topic of prevention. Every nuclear facility, whether it involves mining, enrichment, fuel fabrication, or operating nuclear power plants, poses a proliferation risk and can be a critical step towards developing nuclear weapons. It is crucial to take these risks seriously. If a nuclear bomb were to be used, we would be unable to mitigate the aftermath. Humanity faces two existential threats: climate change and nuclear weapons. Therefore, immediate action is essential. Abolish nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bimal. And I think we have a few minutes for questions if there are any reporters in the audience. All right. Well, if there's no questions, then we'll yield our 4 minutes. Thanks. Thank you for coming.
There are materials and copies of various statements if any journalists or interested parties would like.
I'm just offering, we still have some time, so